Hi, I'm Pranamya and you're watching Pages of the Globe. So if you're new to my channel, basically I read stories, I tell you a little bit about the author who wrote them, and then I give you an analysis about them. I go pretty deep in, I give you a lot of historical context, and I promise you can trust me to be able to give you some deep insight on these stories. Without further ado, let's get on with the introduction. Alright, so the story that we're going to be reading today is Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore. Now, Rabindranath Tagore was born in 1861 and he passed away in 1941. And he was a quite multifaceted, I would say, Indian artist and intellectual whose impact spanned literature, music, and education. Now, I'm just going to give you the quick rundown, the key facts about him. First of all, he was the very first non-European to actually win a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913 for his collection of poems, Gitanjali, which means song offerings, basically. He was a very prolific writer. He authored numerous works, including poetry, short stories, novels, plays, and essays. His notable works include Gitanjali, Home of the World, and Gora. He was also kind of seen as a cultural reformer and still is to this day, because he was a pivotal figure in the Bengal Renaissance. I was like, that doesn't sound right. The Bengal Renaissance, promoting progressive ideas in education, social reform, and the arts. He was Bengali, by the way. He founded the Visva Bharati University in 1921, and it was supposed to be sort of a center for blending these Eastern traditions and Western cultural traditions. Now, as for his philosophical insights, his philosophical outlook was marked by a deep humanism and universalism, advocating for the harmony between cultures and the importance of self-realization. Now, the story that I'm specifically going to be reading to you today is called Kabuliwala, and it's a very touching tale about the bond between a little Bengali girl and a fruit seller in Afghanistan. The story explores themes of friendship, cultural differences, and the universal human emotions that connect us all. So, the story that I'm going to be reading to you today by Rabindranath Tagore is called Kabuliwala, and it was published in 1892 in the Bengali literary magazine Sadhana. It is a very touching tale about the bond between a little Bengali girl and a fruit seller from Afghanistan, and explores themes of friendship, cultural differences, and the universal human emotions that connect each and every one of us. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next.
Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore. My 5-year-old daughter, Minnie, is a chatty girl and likes to talk all day long. It took her about a year after being born to acquire the talent for language, and since then she has not wasted a single wakeful moment of her life remaining silent. Often her mother chides her to keep quiet, but I can never do that. Seeing the girl mute even for an instant seems so odd and unusual to me that I find it unbearable. That's why my conversation with Minnie is often feisty. One morning, as I had just started writing the 17th chapter of my novel, Minnie walked into the room and began, "Dad, our sentry, Ramdayal, doesn't even know how to pronounce the word crow. He's so backward." Before I could enlighten her on the differences between languages, she launched into another topic. "See, Dad, Pola was saying that when elephants lift water from their trunks and spray it from the sky, it rains. Dear, oh dear, Pola can speak such nonsense. He can rant day and night without making any sense." Without waiting for my opinion on it, she asked me out of the blue, "Dad, who is Mum to you?" Sister-in-law, I thought to myself, but to Minnie I replied, avoiding the complicated question, "You go and play with Pola. I have some work now." At this, she flopped beside the writing table, close to my feet, and began to play a game of knick-knack with her hands and knees, rapidly chanting nursery rhymes. In the 17th chapter of my novel, Pratap Singh was jumping off the high balcony of the jailhouse at this time, with Kanchanmala into the river below the dark of night. Stopping her game abruptly, Minnie ran to the window, which overlooked the main road, and began calling out at the top of her voice, "Oh, Kabuliwala, Kabuliwala!" A tall, shabbily clothed Afghan street vendor, with a turban on his head, a bag over his shoulder, and a few boxes of dry grapes in his hands, was passing through the street slowly. I have no idea what flashed through my daughter's mind at the sight of this man, but the moment she saw him, she began yelling. I thought this nuisance with a sack over his shoulder would show up in a moment and I wouldn't be able to finish writing the 17th chapter of my novel. But the moment the Kabuliwala was hearing Minnie's call, turned around with a smile and approached the house. She dashed inside and couldn't be found anywhere. She had this childish fear that if someone looked through the bag of this Afghan man, several living children like herself would be found in there. Meanwhile, the Kabuliwala stepped in the compound and stood at the door with a smile and an Islamic salute. I thought, although the characters in my novel, Pratap Singh and Kanchanmala, were in dire straits, it would be unseemly to call the man all the way to the house and not buy anything. I bought a few items, and soon I was involved in a rambling conversation with him on various topics, including Abdur Rahman, the Emir of Afghanistan, and the frontier policy of the Russians and the British. Finally, as he was about to leave the house, he asked, "Sir, where is your little girl?" To break Minnie's unfounded fear, I called her from inside the house. She came and stood nervously, pressing against my body and looking suspiciously at the Kabuliwala and his bag. The Kabuliwala took out some raisins and apricots from inside the bag and gave it to Minnie, but she refused to take them and remained pressed against my knees with a redoubled suspicion. That was how their first meeting ended. A few days later, as I was leaving the house in the morning for some important work, I saw my tiny daughter sitting on the bench next to the door, speaking non-stop with the Kabuliwala, who was parked right next to her feet and listening to her with a grin, interjecting now and then in broken Bengali to give his opinion. In her short 5-year life, Minnie had never found a more intent listener before other than her father. I also noticed that she had lots of nuts and raisins tied up at the loose end of her small sari. Upon discovering this, I asked the Kabuliwala, "Why did you give all of these to her? Please don't do it again." With that, I took out half a rupee coin and gave it to him. The Kabuliwala took the money without any hesitation and put it in his bag. On returning home, I found that a full-scale row had broken out over the coin. Holding the white, round, shining piece of metal in her hand, Minnie's mother asked her in a rebuking voice, "Where did you get the coin?" Minnie replied, "The Kabuliwala gave it to me." Her mother chided, "Why did you take it from him?" Minnie answered sobbingly, "I didn't ask for it. He gave it on his own." I stepped in to rescue Minnie and took her out for a walk. I learned that this was not her second meeting with the Kabuliwala. He had been visiting Minnie almost daily, and by offering her pistachio nuts, he had already won a large part of the girl's childish heart. The two friends had a few stock phrases and jokes which were repeated in their conversations. For example, the moment she saw Rahmat, my sister would ask with a hearty laugh, "Kabuliwala, oh Kabuliwala, what is in your sack?" And adding an unnecessary nasal tone to the word, Rahmat would roar, "Hanti." The essence of the joke was that the man had an elephant in his sack. Not that the joke was very witty, but it caused two friends to double in laughter, and the sight of that innocent joy between a little girl and a grown man on autumn mornings used to move me deeply. Another routine exchange between the two was, whenever they met, Rahmat would tell the girl in his characteristic thick accent, "Missy, you should never go to the in-laws." Bengali girls were commonly familiar with the term in-laws practically since birth, but being more modern, we chose not to load our daughter's mind with precocious thoughts at such a tender age. That's why Minnie could never fully understand Rahmat's advice. But to keep quiet and not respond to a statement that was contrary to Minnie's nature, therefore turning the phrase into a question, she would ask, "Will you go to your in-laws?" Making a huge fist with his hand, Rahmat would pretend to punch at his imaginary in-law and say, "I'll wallop my in-law." Thinking of the plight of an unknown creature called father-in-law, Minnie would explode into laughter. It was still early morning, that time of the year when kings in ancient days used to go out on conquest. Personally, I've never been away from Kolkata, which is why my mind constantly likes to travel to other places. The moment I hear the name of a foreign country, my mind longs to visit that unknown place. Likewise, the sight of an alien person brings to mind the image of a lonely hut beside a river in the midst of a forest, and I begin to imagine an autonomous, exultant way of life. Yet I am so dull and inert that every time I think of traveling out of my little world, I panic. That's why I used to mitigate my desire for traveling by talking to this man from Kabul in the morning, sitting in front of my writing table in my little room. The Kabuliwala blared out stories of his homeland in his broken Bengali, and I fancied it all before my eyes. Tall, rugged, impassable mountains on two sides, red-hot with torrid heat, and a caravan moving through the narrow, dusty passageway in between. Turbaned traders and travelers passing by, some on camelback, others on foot, some carrying spears, and others outdated flintstone guns. Minnie's mother is naturally a timid person. Whenever she hears a slight noise from the street, she thinks all the tipplers of the world are rushing together towards her house. After living for so many years in this world, though not many, she has still not been able to temper her fear that the world is full of all kinds of horrors. Thieves, robbers, drunkards, snakes, tigers, malaria, cockroaches, and European soldiers. She was not free from suspicion about Kabuliwala, Rahmat, and nagged me to keep a watchful eye on him. Whenever I sought to make light of her suspicions, she would ask me a few pointed questions. Are there no such instances of child abduction? Isn't slave trade still practiced in Afghanistan? Is it altogether impossible for a giant Afghan to kidnap a little child? I had to agree that those were not impossible, but were improbable. However, not everyone has the same capacity for trust, so my wife remained suspicious of the man. But I couldn't stop Rahmat from visiting the house either, because he had done nothing wrong. Every year in January or February, Rahmat would go back to his home country to visit his family. A moneylender, he was unusually busy during this period, collecting dues from his clients before the trip. He had to rush from house to house to raise the collectibles, and yet he found time to visit Mimi. It appeared as if the two were involved in a mischievous plot. The day he couldn't come in the morning, he came in the evening. To see that huge Afghan sitting in the corner of the house in the dark of the evening in his baggy clothes and customary sack would create a sudden fear in my mind. But the moment I saw Minnie rushing out of the house and greeting her friend, Kabuliwala, oh Kabuliwala, and the chums of incompatible years engaging in their familiar bantering and innocent laughter, my heart would fill with delight. One morning I was sitting in my room and reading some proofs. It was the end of winter, but for the last few days, before the season came to a close, the temperature was freezing and almost unbearable. I was enjoying the warmth of a strip of morning sun that had lighted on my feet under the table, traveling through the glass window. It was about 8 o'clock, and most of the early risers had finished their morning walk, with their necks wrapped in scarves, and returned home. Just then I heard some commotion in the street. Looking out, I saw our Rahmat in handcuffs, escorted by 2 policemen, with a whole host of street urchins trailing after them. There were marks of blood on Rahmat's clothes, and a policeman was carrying a blood-stained knife. I stepped out and accosted the policeman, demanding to know what was going on. Putting together details from Rahmat as well as policemen, I understood that one of our neighbors was indebted to Rahmat for a Rampuri shawl, and when the man denied his debt, an argument broke out between them. In the heat of the argument, Rahmat took out a knife and stabbed the man. Rahmat was in the midst of hurling abuse in obscene language at the dishonest man when Minnie came running out of the house, shouting, "Kabuliwala, oh Kabuliwala!" In a flash, Rahmat's face was filled with expressions of happiness. Since he didn't have a sling bag over his shoulder that day, their usual exchange on the subject could not take place. So Minnie asked him straight off, "Will you be going to your in-laws' house?" "That's exactly where I'm going," Rahmat replied with a laugh. When he noticed that Minnie did not find the answer quite amusing, he pointed to his hands and added in heavily accented patchy Bengali, "I would have beaten up the in-law, but what can I do? My hands are tied up." Charged with grievous injury, Rahmat was sent to jail for several years. We almost forgot about him. Living our days through our daily routines in the security of our home, it never occurred to us once how this free-spirited man from the mountains was spending his years the secluded walls of the jail. And the way Minnie's inconstant little heart behaved was embarrassing, even to her father. She easily forgot her old friend and found a new one in Nabi, the Sais. Then she continued to grow up, and she replaced all her elderly male friends, one after another, with girls her own age. She was hardly to be seen in her father's studio. In a way, I almost ended all friendship with her. Several years passed. It was autumn again. Minnie's wedding match had been fixed. She was getting married during Puja holidays. This event will take the joy of our household to her in-law's house, leaving us in the darkness. It was a sunny, resplendent morning. The rain-washed sun of early autumn took the hue of pure gold. Its brilliance made the dingy, run-down brick houses in the inner lanes of Kolkata look beautiful. The wedding music had started playing in the house since dawn. Each note of that music seemed to come right from my ribcage in a sobbing tune, and spread the sorrow of an impending farewell to the world, mixing itself with the radiant shafts of the autumnal sun. My Minnie was to get married that day. There was a lot of hubbub in the house since visitors were continually loitering in and out. A tent was being put up on bamboo poles in the courtyard of the house, and the chimes of chandeliers were being rigged in the portico of every room filled the air. There was no end to the rumpus. I was going through the wedding accounts in my study when suddenly Rahmat walked into the room and stood before me with a salam. At first I couldn't recognize him. He didn't have that customary sack with him or the long hair and his burly look. Finally I recognized him through a smile. I asked him, "Hello, Rahmat. How long have you been back?" "I was released from jail last evening," he replied. The words gave me a sudden jolt. I had never seen a homicide before, so my heart flinched at the sight of a man. I wished you would leave the house immediately on this auspicious day. I said, "We have a wedding in the house today, and I am quite busy. It's better for you to go now." At that he began to leave the house, but as he reached the door, he turned back in hesitation and asked in a faltering tone, "Can't I see the girl for one moment?" Perhaps he was convinced that Minnie was still the same little girl and would come out of the house running to meet him. Kabuliwala, oh Kabuliwala, as in the past. Their happy, playful relationship of old had remained unchanged. Remembering their past friendship, he had even bought a box of grapes and a few raisins wrapped in a packet, which he must have borrowed from some Afghan friend because his own customary sack was not there with him. "There is a festivity in the house today. It won't be possible to see anyone at this time." He looked a little hurt by the statement and stood stupefied for a time, gazing at me with a fixed look. Then he walked out of the room abruptly with a simple bye. I felt remorseful and thought I should call him back, but right then I saw him turning around. Standing close to me, he said, "I bought these grapes and raisins for the little girl. Hope you don't mind giving it to her." I took the fruits from him and was about to pay some money when he grabbed my hand and said, "You're a generous man, sir, and I'll never forget your kindness, but please don't pay me for these fruits. Just as you have a daughter, I too have one back home. It is for remembering her face that I bring these gifts for your child. I don't come here for business." With that, he shoved his hand inside his huge baggy shirt and brought out a grimy piece of paper from somewhere close to his chest. Unfolding it very carefully, he laid the paper open on the table. I could see the impression of a very small hand on it. Not a photograph, not a painting, but the trace of a small hand created with burnt charcoal daubed on the palm. Every year Rahmat came to peddle merchandise on the streets of Kolkata, carrying that memorabilia of his daughter in his pocket, as if the soft touch of that little hand kept his huge lonely heart fed with love and happiness. My eyes filled with tears at the sight of that piece of paper. It no longer matter to me that he was an ordinary fruit peddler from Kabul and I belonged to an aristocratic Bengali family. In a moment, I realized that we were both just the same. He was a father and so was I. The print of his mountain-dwelling daughter's hand reminded me of my own Minnie. I sent word for her to come out to the study immediately. Many of the women objected, but I paid no mind. In her bridal dress and ceremonial makeup, Minnie came out from the inner quarters and stood beside me coyly. The Kabuliwala saw Minnie and became confused. Their good-natured humor of old also didn't work out. In the end, with a smile, he asked, "Girl, are you going to the in-laws' house?" Minnie now understood what in-law meant, so she couldn't answer the way she did in the past. Rather, hearing the question from Rahmat, her face became purple in shame, and she abruptly turned around and left. This brought back memories of their first meeting, and I felt an ache in my heart. Soon after Minnie left, Rahmat slouched on the floor with a long, deep sigh. It became obvious to him that his own daughter had grown up as well, and he would have to get to know her all over again. She would not be the same girl he had left behind. He was not even sure what might have happened to her in the past 8 years. The wedding music continued to play softly in the courtyard on that autumnal sunny morning. And sitting there, on the floor of my house in an alley in Kolkata, Rahmat continued to envision the images of the arid, hilly terrains of Afghanistan. I took out some money and gave it to him. "You go back to your daughter in Afghanistan, Rahmat, and may the happiness of your union bring blessings for my Minnie too," I said. I had to cut out 1 or 2 items from the eclat of the festivities for gifting that money. For example, the lighting decoration was not as gorgeous as I had wanted it to be, and the band party had to be cancelled. This upset the women, but buoyed by a benevolent spirit, my auspicious ceremony became even more luminous. The end. Alright, so that was Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore. Now, before I jump straight to the analysis, I'm just going to give you a very quick summary. So we see the narrator's 5-year-old daughter, who starts talking very young, and she can't stop talking for a minute. She's constantly talking. She's very, funny, extroverted girl. Now, one day, she suddenly catches sight of a Kabuliwala outside, and he's dressed in these dirty, baggy clothes. And so the narrator thinks that he spells trouble, and he talks about, how he won't be able to finish the chapter he's working on. So, as the Kabuliwala comes up to the house, she suddenly becomes afraid, and so she runs away. But the narrator still invites him in, and he buys some things for him as they talk about the Afghani politics and things like that. Now, after a while, Kabuliwala becomes friends with Minnie, and they're always talking to each other, and they're always having fun. Even though the mom is kind of scared that, what if he kidnaps her or something? The dad knows that this guy just wants to hang out with Minnie, and he probably sees something in her. So anyway, Kabuliwala, he's always offering her nuts and pistachios, and he even gives her the money that her dad gave him for all the fruits and nuts. Now, later on, at one point, he's taken to jail, and he is going to be leaving. He's going to be in prison for several years. But even then, as Minnie appears and goes up to him, he still grins and he still has that casual, joking manner with her. Now, he's sentenced to prison, like I said, for many years, and by the time he's released, Minnie has already forgotten about him, and she's about to go get married now, when Kabuliwala suddenly appears again. And at first, the narrator is asking him to leave because he's like, he thinks that it might bring something bad on such an auspicious day of the wedding. But Kabuliwala comes back and he says, "Hey, can you just give these treats that I brought to him? And I don't want any money, but I've come with my own daughter in mind." And he tells him about how he left his daughter home, and he brings this memento of his daughter with him as he leaves home to sell fruit. And it's just this tiny little hand imprint. And with tears in his eyes, the narrator says that at that moment, he stopped thinking about how Kabuliwala was this Afghan raisin seller, and I was from an aristocratic Bengali family. Instead, he realized that they both were fathers. And so he asks Minnie to come down. Now, she comes down and they're not able to have that same sort of back and forth banter, so she's still too shy and she leaves embarrassed, which is very similar to how she did in the beginning. And with a great sigh, Kabuliwala just sits on the floor and understands that his own daughter is probably going to act the same. She has grown up now and he's going to have to get to know her again after 8 years of being gone. Now, the narrator gives Kabuliwala presumably a lot of money and tells him to go back to Afghanistan, and that his blessed reunion with his daughter will hopefully also bring some blessings to Minnie as well. Now, towards the end of it, that means that he can't pay for some of the other things in the wedding because he gave so much money to the Afghan seller. However, he believes that this ceremony was lit by a more gracious type of light. Now, as for the analysis, this is a very interesting and it pulls at your heartstrings. It's that kind of story because we automatically see Minnie in her early childhood, and this constant chatter that she has, especially starting from a young age, shows that she has this natural curiosity with the world. And we can also see that in the father, as he's always talking about how he wants to travel, and even as he writes his book, the 17th chapter of his book, we see that he's writing about this interesting moment where it's this adventure story, and it shows that it reveals how much he is interested in the world and adventure and travel. We also see that Minnie and her dad have a very loving relationship. For example, when she asks him what relation her mom is to him, he's kind of hard to it's hard for him to explain because he's like, well, your mom is my wife, and he doesn't really know how to answer that, so he just tells her to go play. But this sort of innocent exchange would probably be one that Minnie's mom would have scolded her for, but it highlights the kind of playful, loving relationship she has with her dad. Now, when the Kabuliwala comes in and the narrator thinks that he spells trouble, he only sees trouble in Kabuliwala, meaning that he's already kind of slightly biased towards him and will treat him as an inferior rather than an equal. However, soon after, when they become friends, we see Kabuliwala start to take a more fatherly role, shown by the narrator's ability to draw parallels between how he listens to Minnie and how Kabuliwala is listening to her. Because he says himself, he's like, oh, Minnie has never found such an intent listener as I when you see Kabuliwala. Now, at one point when Minnie and the Tad are taking a walk together and she tells him all about her and Kabuliwala's relationship, we see that while the narrator might enjoy seeing Minnie and the Kabuliwala together, it's something that he personally is outside of and has no part in this. And this kind of foreshadows the distance that will sprout between them as they get older. Now, one of the jokes between Minnie and Kabuliwala, whose name is actually Rahmat, involves her eventually having to leave to go to her in-laws' house. And we see that the narrator himself is kind of hesitant to talk about exactly why and what even is an in-law, even though that's something that during that time girls were already taught at a very young age because their main goal in life was to get married at the time. So even though most girls during this time already knew what an in-law was, her dad hasn't told her. And we can likely guess it's really just because he's reluctant to talk about it because he doesn't want her to. And Rahmat's half-joking pleas with her to not go away to her in-laws' house betrays the fear that both men have about Minnie growing up. As revealed later for Rahmat, Minnie growing up signifies that his own daughter will have grown up, and he's going to have to get to know her all over again. Now, eventually, when Rahmat gets taken away and he's in handcuffs, even when he's covered in blood, he's still trying to talk with Minnie. His love for Minnie motivates him to remain strong and protect her from the knowledge that something deeply kind of dark and disturbing has taken place. And so he's still joking with her. He's still joking with her until he gets taken away. Now, once he gets taken away to prison, Minnie very soon forgets about him, which the narrator is almost kind of embarrassed about, because with Rahmat's imprisonment, all of the different connections holding Minnie, the narrator, and Rahmat together, first of all, seem to disappear. So Rahmat is no longer remembered. So the narrator retreats further into himself, and Minnie breaks away from him to make friends of her own. And so now she's starting to make friends with girls her own age, and presumably her mother now. Now she is probably going to be closer to her mom because she's slowly growing into a woman and she connects more with her mom. This is the first indication that she will become more like her mother as she grows up and begins learning how to be a wife before her marriage. Again, during this time, the best thing a girl could do was be a good wife. So she was obviously going to be more closer to her mom, trying to learn how to be a good wife. Now, years later, when it's her wedding time and Kabuliwala and the narrator are meeting, at first, the narrator is kind of nervous, and he seems to have dropped his former openness and adopted his fearful wife's attitude towards outsiders. He doesn't want to remember Ramath's connection with Minnie, and he wants to protect his daughter from the danger of a quote-unquote would-be murderer poses because he loves her. However, Ramath, who belongs to a lower social class and therefore would be expected to do as he's told, shows just how much he still loves Minnie by asking to see her even after he's been told to leave by someone in a position of authority. And when the Kabuliwala shows the little handprint that he has from his daughter, that exact moment is when the father realizes that the two men are connected by their fatherhood, their deep love for their daughters, and their former closeness with Minnie. Because of this, Ramath no longer is seen as a threat, but as an equal who deserves to see Minnie on her wedding day. Now, Minnie's disappointing reaction to Ramath's attempt to revive their old joke is due to the fact that she now knows what it means. Depending on context, it can either mean a prison or a father-in-law. And Minnie now understands that Ramath has been to prison, and she also recognizes that this means she will be going away as well, but in a different sort of way. Furthermore, Minnie has always been a sort of stand-in for Kabuliwala's actual daughter. They're similar ages, presumably, and they might even have had similar personalities. I mean, all kids in the beginning are normally super chatty and very curious and fun loving. So in her reaction to Kabuliwala's appearance, Ramath foresees his own daughter's reaction and the fear that his connection with his daughter too will have strained to a breaking point by his absence. However, the narrator, he sees this. He sees that Ramath is scared now that his own daughter will shun him. And they both are well aware of what they've lost in regards to the relationships with their daughters, and it has brought them together at last. So at this point, the final interaction that Ramath and Minnie have helps the narrator understand that it's time to let go, and he pays it forward by giving Ramath the money that he needs to get reacquainted with his daughter. And although the story ends on somewhat of a somber note, it also ends with a sense of hope. The narrator has finally made a connection to Ramath, and the shared connection and the love that they have for their daughters helps give the wedding a kinder and more gracious light. Anyway, that's it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below not only your opinion and analysis of the story, but what short story you would like me to read next. Bye!